Welcome to the ListenUp Podcast, where we explore hearing loss, communication, connections, and health.
Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Mark Sims here. I'm the host of the ListenUp Podcast, where I feature top leaders in healthcare. Past guests include incredible medical leaders, including Dr. Tamara Lieberman and Dr. Mark Strasser. This episode is brought to you by Arizona Hearing Center. I help patients to effectively treat their hearing loss so they can connect better with their family and friends and remain independent. The reason I'm so passionate about helping patients is because I lost my brother Robbie twice. First from his hearing loss from radiation to his brain tumor, then again when he passed away. I only care for ears. I am the ear of ENT who's performed over 10,000 ear surgeries over the past 20 years. I'm the founder of Arizona Hearing Center. I'm also the author of Listen Up. Go to listenuphearing.com to learn more about the book. For my clinical practice, go to www.azhear.com. Please contact us with any questions or comments. Today, I'm really excited to have Dr. Ryan McCreery, who's the Director of Research at Boys Town National Research Hospital, where he's also the Director of Audiology, Audibility, Perception, and Cognition Laboratory, and Director of the Center for Audiology. He certainly wears a lot of hats in those titles. Dr. McCreery completed his PhD in 2011 at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. His lab's current research is focused on various aspects of hearing amplification, language processing, and language development. This is the type of stuff Listen Up's about, folks. Findings from Dr. McCreery's research are directly related to clinical outcomes and have led to optimized clinical protocols for fitting hearing aids in kids with hearing loss. He's co-authored many publications and has numerous research collaborations. He speaks all over the world about these issues, and he's an active member of ASHA. Was recently recognized in 2020 with the prestigious ASHA Fellowship. By the way, I'd like to give a great shout out to Dr. Drew Dundas for connecting me with Dr. McCreery and enable me to have him on Listen Up today. Dr. McCreery, welcome and thanks for coming on the podcast. I'm really great to see you.
Thanks, Dr. Sims. I'm really excited to be here. I've really enjoyed listening to the episodes of your podcast, and I think they're very thought-provoking and really relevant to our industry. So I appreciate the opportunity.
That's great. So, well, then maybe I'm a little formulaic, but, one of the things I always like to ask my guests is how did you end up here? Like, we all have a story. People had an inspirational moment. And I think that that's really important for people to understand the passion or what the journey was. So tell me how you're sitting in the chair running a big audiology research and organization doing audiology research. One day you weren't that guy. How'd you get there or decide to go to this path?
So my career in audiology started out as a clinical audiologist working at Boys Town National Research Hospital. And I saw patients, adults and kids fit hearing aids, did diagnostic testing, and I really enjoyed that. And one day, my mentor, Dr. Pat Stomakowitz, came to me and said, hey, you ask a lot of really good questions in staff meetings, and I'd really like to get you involved in some of the research that we're doing around hearing aids in the lab, because I think you could probably be a good researcher. And I said, I really like this audiology thing. I like having a paycheck and a job. But she convinced me to go back and start my PhD after I had been out working as an audiologist for about 8 years. And during that process, I became really interested in this idea about why you can have two patients who sort of appear to be identical in terms of their audiometric findings, who give you really different outcomes or have different sort of responses to amplification. And so I focused on my dissertation on some speech recognition related outcomes. And then since that time, I've really tried to focus my own research on that. And so after Dr. Stomakowitz retired, I took over her role as director of audiology. And then a few years ago was promoted to director of research. So it's a great role. And I love it because I can't think of a better time to be in our field. And to be helping people, who are deaf and hard of hearing.
So, I tell you two things that strike me there. One was if you were just so fortunate to have a mentor or somebody who kind of encouraged you, which is really great. The other thing, I was talking to somebody today who was talking about how, I didn't know this, but at one point, one of the large hearing aid chains was owned by Bausch & Lomb. And the reason was Bausch & Lomb thought that they could do hearing aids like vision. And, you and I both know how mistaken that was. It's interesting. One of the comments the guy said is, but I think it'll get there. And I said, I don't think it'll ever get there. It's just so profoundly different with the psychosocial overlays that are associated. I mean, people know when they hear well, they don't know when they see well, they don't know when they don't hear well. And it's kind of fascinating because there will not, I don't think, even though people are trying that, drive through hearing aids are really going to get people where they really need to be, but we can explore that some further. So that's great. So now you do research. So, and those are the questions. So what is the focus of your work in terms of your laboratory?
So the research that I've been engaged in sort of over the last 10 years has really been focused on separating the contributions of hearing aids as part of our intervention process from the other pieces of intervention that we think about. So if you think about the care that an audiologist provides, it could include counseling, it could include the hearing aid, support, all those types of things. And I'm really interested in sort of looking at the hearing aid and amplification as a sort of filter and treating it almost like medication and looking at things like what is the dosage of your hearing aid and what can we do to sort of increase the potency of wearing a hearing aid? And if that's the case, are there ways that we can modify it to sort of make it more effective? Because I think you and I have both worked with patients who we anticipated based on their degree of hearing loss that they would be a great candidate for a hearing aid. And for whatever reason, we can't figure it out. So I think that, definitely ties into what you were just talking about with the visual analogy that we, if it were just as simple as providing audibility and, restoring the what's lost based on the hearing loss, our jobs would be a lot easier, and Bausch and Lomb probably would have been a lot more successful in that endeavor.
Yeah, it really resonates. So when I look back at many patients who have cochlear implants in my career, the ones that didn't do well, it's only through practice did I realize that it was a cognitive issue, right? That we can drive the signal to the cochlear nerve and probably deliver it to the brain, but the brain just wasn't able to process the information, and that resonates. And the other thing I'll tell you is in our practice, I tell people we try to deconstruct their hearing experience, right? Is your ear canal, your ear bones right? Is your cochlea right? Is the technology that you're wearing right? Is your brain right? I mean, it's so many different things. It's a fascinating system. So,
yeah, and I think what we're finding from a lot of our research that's coming out now is that there can be interactions between those things. So you have somebody who isn't a good candidate for a hearing aid because of their cognitive ability, perhaps, but sometimes wearing a hearing aid gives you better access so that you can more easily process information. And in children, we're finding that hearing aid use and the amount of access that kids get to their hearing aids is actually a really good predictor of things like working memory and executive function. So there's an interplay there that I think is really fascinating, and it makes it such an important research question because these are things that we can impact with our treatment and with our care of patients. And we may not be able to fix an underlying cognitive issue, but we can minimize the amount of sort of cognitive processing and effort that goes into that listening experience for those patients. And so I think it's an interesting puzzle, and it's what gets me out of bed in the morning.
Well, so that makes me think like, sometimes it's better hearing, not perfect hearing, right? And that's better than no improvement in their hearing. But that's fascinating. Do you have any insight like on the mechanism in children of better executive function? Is it an engagement issue? Is it a social integration issue? Or is it a cognitive issue?
So it's a really interesting area of research that, people like David Pisoni and others, his colleagues have been actively engaged in this area of research for many, many years. And the current theory that I think has the most weight behind it is this idea that having early auditory experience essentially gives you access to language, but language sort of unlocks your access to these interactions with people and with objects and with your environment that are sort of reciprocal. And so what I mean by that is you have the opportunity to develop things like joint attention with your parents when they're talking to you, and those things sort of scaffold each other. So the early auditory experience is the important part that sort of provides the rocket fuel for that process through language and through interaction that sort of leads to those developments in executive function and sort of executive control. So your ability to sort of control your behavior and reach goals requires you to have this sort of cognitive system that's informed by your language development. And that's sort of the underlying theory, I think, that it's this sort of system where these things are interactive over time. And it's just fascinating to watch it play out in kids after we fit them with hearing aids, because we definitely see that in our patients.
My youngest is a teenager now, but it really brings up that when they were younger, that at least when I was reading all the new parenting stuff, I don't know what's out now because my kids are a little older, but the whole IQ versus EQ, the concept of EQ, right? Emotional quotient. So I think that's kind of a model for that type of issue, it sounds like.
Yeah, it's so important, to build those communication interactions with children so that they not only have the opportunity to develop the ability to communicate, but also just you think about all the different ways that you function in your environment or self-talk or any of those strategies that we use to sort of manage our emotions or our responses to things are based in language. And so I think it's such an important early building block. And that's why our intervention programs here at Boys Town really focus on that aspect of the process, because we've really bought into that idea.
That's great. This is great work. So, as I always say, I'm a otologist aspiring to understand this field a little bit better. One of the things that is always interesting to me is I have certain patients who will say, when I pop my ears, my hearing is amazingly better. And I try to explain to them that it's only a couple of dB improvement, but it does bring in that concept that a little improvement to some patients can be perceived as an incredibly big functional change. And so, any insight into that kind of perception on patients, because that's what you're talking about, is hearing perception and function in terms of your work. Can you help the listeners to better understand that?
Yeah, I think that's so fascinating. I've actually experienced that myself, where I have some eustachian tube dysfunction off and on, where I need to pop my ears because of allergies or whatever. And it is such a dramatic change. And from seeing patients that you'll have patients who come in with what they perceive to be pretty significant hearing complaints, and we put them in the booth and their hearing really isn't elevated that much at all. And I think it speaks to the fact that our auditory experience sort of creates this expectation or this template that we have in our brain, and we're pretty sensitive to modifications of that. And I think it's this sort of auditory experience or template that we have that when it changes even a little bit, it can be very disruptive. So I don't know if you've ever had the experience of listening to a spatialized sound under headphones, where they've taken someone else's head-related transfer function and applied it to the sound that you're listening to under the headphones. So normally, when you're hearing something in an environment, it gets shaped by your head, right? And you're really used to listening to the environment through your own head and your own two ears. And so you can have these experiences where you get these odd artifacts when you're listening through someone else's head-related transfer function that sort of remind you how sensitive you are to your very specific experience, but also your very specific acoustics of your head and things like that. And if you manipulate those parameters, it can be very disorienting. And we have an experiment that we do in our anechoic chamber here at Boys Town that you can manipulate those things, and it can be very disorienting if you don't have visual feedback.
So I can try on somebody else's head.
Yeah, it is. And you wouldn't think, and those are very small and subtle changes. So I think it just speaks to the amazing auditory system that we have, and the level of sensitivity that we have to those changes is really amazing.
Do you have a tool to measure people's subjective reporting of these things in your research? Or
we have lots and lots of tools, as you know, but I don't know any that are as sensitive as just a person's own subjective, sort of objective self-report of, wow, this sounds really different, or it sounds muffled. And I really do think we need better tools that are more, sensitive than the audiogram to detecting those types of changes, because we can get at acuity really well, but the quality piece is so elusive. And I think that's a really interesting direction for future research.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I explain to patients is, one of the biggest complaints I see is ear fullness, and it's more often than not hearing loss, right? And so explaining to them that the brain is not getting the information. So it gives you the perception of fullness, but we don't have a word in our vocabulary that is, I'm speech reading and I'm contextually communicating with you, but it's not getting to my ears. So I have a perception of being blocked. It's a fascinating, because we don't have a word for that.
Well, and another example that I'm sure you encounter often is just the way that different people perceive tinnitus.
Yes.
And that is such a great example of something that we don't have a physical way necessarily in most cases to measure. There's some really cool neuroimaging research that's happening trying to look at what tinnitus looks like in the brain when it happens for people that have significant tinnitus. But I think we're a long way from understanding, why you can have, this perception that's not physically there in the environment, and also why it manifests so differently for different people.
Yeah. Well, I certainly think there's a psychological overlay. Certainly, it's first bad. Obviously, sleep deprivation, depression, and anxiety all play a role. But I agree, it's much more complex than me just saying, "Oh, those are the three factors." So, one of the other things that's always interesting is how patients talk about background noise and how that impacts people's ability to hear. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of that particular phenomenon that people report?
Yeah, I think it's really so. There's sort of two groups of people that interest me with regard to that complaint. So the first would be people that have complaints of background noise without any sort of obvious auditory problem, and by that I mean people who have a normal audiogram and otherwise normal auditory findings, but they come in and they are, really struggling in background noise, and maybe more than they've ever struggled in background noise. And I think one of the themes that you keep hitting on in our discussion here is related to that sort of psychological and cognitive component to all of the hearing related issues that we're talking about. And some of our research has really highlighted the importance of things like working memory and executive function to being able to understand speech and background noise.
Right.
And those are things that are certainly tied to your hearing, but are more sort of domain general in the fact that they impact all
rather than hearing or.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it impacts all of your functioning, right? And so I think it's such a cool, interesting. I mean, the patients who are complaining about these things don't think it's cool because they're struggling to hear in a restaurant when they're out with their friends. But I think it's good that we are starting to get an understanding about the role of these cognitive factors in listening and background noise, because I think it sort of takes a broader view. The other thing that I'm always surprised about is people that sort of have a minimum or a mild amount of hearing loss who previously didn't have difficulty in background noise, but are now having difficulty in background noise. And the challenge there is you could fit them with a hearing aid that's going to restore audibility to the signal. But when you think about listening in background noise, the hearing aid in many cases is simply just going to amplify a mixture of the speech and noise together. So it's not necessarily going to help with that speech and noise problem. And I think in some ways, if you think about increasing the level of the signal, it could make it worse because you're sort of taking a system that has broadened filters compared to the normal case of normal hearing, and you're making it louder, which could make it more difficult for the person to sort of understand. So I think we're starting to investigate why even just very minimal amounts of hearing loss by traditional definitions are having these big impacts on people, because you see these complaints often in the clinic, but right now as audiologists we don't have tools to help those patients, and it can be kind of frustrating to help us.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but some of them are accommodation too, though, that people are getting used to the increased signal, and that's one of the issues too. That there is at least in my discussions with patients, some sort of brain filtering that starts to occur. Because, when you haven't heard everything, all of a sudden you hear it, you don't know what is or isn't important. I see that in stapedectomy patients too, where, they get all the sound, they're like, everything's loud. And then over time, their brain figures out what it does and doesn't want to hear.
Yeah. And it's been there have been studies with hearing aids looking at this process that we often as audiologists refer to as acclimatization. Mm-hmm. And this idea that you get used to the loudness of the hearing aid. But what's really interesting is they've tried to do experiments where they actually measure loudness for these people, and they can't find that their loudness perception is changing significantly. And so it's one of those things that we observe all the time, where you have a brand new hearing aid user who doesn't, who says it's very loud, and then a month later they've worn their hearing aid and they're used to it. But it's such a fascinating thing because it's something that we see in the clinic every day, but we can't figure out what the root of it is.
Yeah, are there studies about how long it takes?
Yeah, there was a study that Gitte Keitzer from the National Acoustics Laboratories in Australia published maybe about 10 years ago, where they followed these patients during their initial new hearing aid users, and it took them about 6 to 8 weeks to sort of stop having that be a prevalent complaint. And so we use that to counsel patients about the time course, and of course, wearing the hearing aids is the best way to get used to them. So the patients that have more hearing aid use during that initial period seem to adapt faster. But there are people who we fit with hearing aids who just have a very difficult time getting used to that increased loudness. And we spend a lot of time working with them because we know it's important for them to have that, but we don't want the loudness to be a barrier to them using their devices.
Yeah. I mean, it's just amazing. And I agree with you. They usually, if you can counsel them and get them through, it's like riding a Bronco, you get to the end and or an unbroken horse. Not that I want to say the patient's being broke, but you got to ride the rough part to get to the smooth part, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, these are great topics. I mean, one of the things that comes to mind is, oftentimes many state mandated is a 30-day trial period, which I've always said to people is way too short. I think it's 2 months because, I see so many patients who say, well, I tried hearing aids. They were too loud. I returned them. And it's kind of a shame that, and that really undermines just people pursuing technology because that person got to the precipice, right? They went all the way. They got the technology. They pursued it. They overcame all the stigmas that they perceived, and then they didn't get great benefit. And it's kind of a shame, but it's part of the process.
Yes, I agree. In our clinics, we actually have negotiated with manufacturers to extend our trial periods out to 60 days whenever possible. And not all of our manufacturers will allow that, but many of them are willing to do that for the reasons that you mentioned, because we really don't think that 30 days is enough time, even for someone that's wearing their hearing aid quite a lot, to sort of go through that process of adaptation.
Yeah, and even I think experienced hearing aid wearers changing technology, it takes them that time to really get used to the new experience too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember a period of time early in my career when we were transitioning from analog to digital hearing aids, and patients were so excited because it was digital. And then you fit them with the digital hearing aid and they would think that it would just be this amazing experience, that everything was better, but they didn't like the sound of it. It sounded different to them. It's a little bit like music aficionados that love the sound of an analog amplifier. Some of those patients had a hard time, even though they were really motivated and excited about the technology change. And so we would often try to modify the signal processing of the new digital hearing aid to try to match their perception of what the old analog device sounded like. But in some cases, what they were appreciating, what they liked, was distortion, because there was more distortion in the analog device. But it's like some music where you like the distortion. I think they'd gotten used to that. And so it took them some time to get used to we think of a cleaner signal always being better. But in those cases, their preference was for the distorted sound because they were used to that, and it had become part of their template, I guess.
If you like bass guitar and you take it away, it's the music's not as vibrant. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have a couple of patients who still seek out the very few analog solutions out there and are still unwilling to change. So it is fascinating.
We have a few of those as well.
So I know one of the things we were talking about was, some of the work you're doing is on your candidacy for mild hearing loss. There are these patients who come in and they have a very mild hearing loss. Actually, a lot of our people in the field might say your hearing's normal, or you don't need a hearing aid yet, which is always fascinating to me. I'm not sure. It's kind of like you have diabetes, but we don't do anything about it, or you have high blood pressure and we don't do anything about it. I'm always fascinated by that. That's another topic. But in terms of a candidacy and the impact of mild hearing loss, what are you guys finding?
Yeah, we're finding with both children and adults that using this sort of arbitrary category of mild hearing loss, which, by the way, has no basis in research or scientific basis.
It's just a numerical basis on the scale, right? Where people have just kind of marked it off.
Yeah, someone divided the audiogram into 4 categories, roughly equal, and gave them names that they felt like described the difficulties that someone might have. But we see patients every day who have what we would consider mild hearing loss based on the audiogram, whose difficulties are in no way, shape, or form mild at all. They're really struggling. And so we have really tried to focus on both kids and adults, focusing on their subjective reports of difficulty rather than what the audiogram says, because the audiogram, as we know, is a good tool. And I'm not suggesting that we get rid of it because it helps us to quantify how much hearing loss you have. But I think by calling it mild hearing loss, we're almost setting ourselves up for low expectations for benefit, because
you're undermining the significance of the problem, right?
Absolutely. So we've tried for both kids and adults to look at what we think the functional impact will be, and to try to develop some data around that so audiologists can know what tools are available beyond the audiogram to sort of help them to make those decisions. Because I think audiologists don't want to give someone a hearing aid if they don't need it. But I think right now our sort of criteria is a little bit too strict, and we don't probably fit people we should be fitting or who could benefit, because we've decided that because it's mild, they're not going to benefit. And I think that's a missed opportunity, because we know from some studies that the earlier that we get adults into amplification, the more likely they are to be successful over the long run and remain socially engaged, and all those benefits that come along with hearing aids.
Yeah, the answer is not let's let them get so bad that they actually perceive the benefit so much that they'll want the hearing aids. I think that's one of the mindsets in some of the providers. And I'm always befuddled because people come in, they have these incredibly subjective responses that they're doing so poorly. And then I say, you should get hearing technology. They go, really? Is it that bad? I go, don't listen to me. Listen to yourself. You're the one that just told me. So in terms of those subjective things, like how do you measure that? Do you have measuring tools to measure those types of things in terms of functional compromise or what they report, their subjective report of hearing difficulty? How do you measure that?
So in adults, we've started using some of the work related to the hearing health, the hearing handicap inventory for adults, or the hearing handicap inventory for the elderly. And Larry Humes has some studies that show that success with amplification is predicted by the audiogram, as well as these types of functional questionnaires. So I think questionnaires have had a bad rap for a long time among audiologists because there's so many of them.
And very long, I will say. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you need something that's efficient and that's relevant to the patient. And I think the HHIA and the HHIE are both relevant tools. And now we have data to suggest that they, along with the audiogram, really predict benefit from amplification in the pre-fitting phase. And I think more audiologists using those tools it would help them to make decisions about those cases that we currently consider borderline. For kids, they can't really tell us their difficulties. And so we've had to do some really interesting work where we look at the speech intelligibility index, which is a way to quantify the impact of the audiogram on access for speech.
Right.
And if we look at the audiogram and then we take into account their ear canal acoustics, we can project what their language development outcomes are going to be like from some longitudinal work that we've done.
Mm-hmm.
And we found that children who have a speech intelligibility index less than 80, so they're missing 80% or more of long-term average speech spectrum in quiet, those kids need amplification, regardless of what the audiogram shows. Because one of the challenges with measuring hearing in kids is we put these earphones in their ears that are calibrated in a coupler that's designed to mimic an adult ear canal. But when you put that same earphone in a baby's ear, the sound level is higher. And so it's giving them an advantage on their hearing test, and it makes it look like their hearing thresholds are actually better.
It underestimates their loss.
Yeah. And so when we correct for that, we find that some of these mild losses in children are actually much greater than we were predicting. And that's one of the reasons why in the literature over the years, you look at outcomes for kids with mild degrees of hearing loss, and they're kind of all over the place because we've never really taken into account the effect of ear canal acoustics on our test. So I would say those are the two tools that we've been focusing on, both for kids and adults, to try to figure out who are the good hearing aid candidates who are going to benefit, and who are the candidates who, we want them to come back in a year and talk to us again.
So I've likely seen those instruments. I would tell you, I can't. What are the types of questions on those instruments?
So the HHIE and HHIA ask questions about listening difficulty across a wide range of listening situations that the person's in, their perceived frustration, motivation.
Right.
So if you got a group of professionals together to ask them, what do you think the relevant constructs are that predict whether someone's going to be successful with a hearing aid, it touches on a lot of those things in the questionnaires.
Oh, that's great.
So I think it's got a lot of sort of good real world application. And I think the patients, it also can give you as an audiologist a place to start in terms of having conversations about the specific areas where patients are having problems, so that after you fit the hearing aid, you can revisit them and say, did we make this better, or just make your life more complicated?
It's a set point to start the conversation, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's really great. One of the things I was thinking about, is fatigue and hearing. Does fatigue, I suspect, impacts your hearing? Does it depend on the time of day, your ability to hear? Are those types of measurements? Are you seeing that type of finding?
Yeah, so there's some really interesting research happening right now at Vanderbilt. And Ben Hornsby is the scientist who's sort of leading that charge for both kids and adults. And what they're finding is that what you're describing is absolutely true. So as you go through the day and you get more tired and you've sort of expended your cognitive energy, listening becomes more challenging. And I think we've all had that personal experience where after a really long day, we don't want to do anything that's really challenging from a listening standpoint. Or, I have the experience at the end of the day where sometimes if I exercise and have a chance to just relax, then I'm much more focused and able to sort of attend to what I need to attend to, especially if I'm going to have to go out to dinner at a restaurant or something. So I think absolutely what you're describing, I hear it from patients. I experienced it myself. And it's good that investigators like Dr. Hornsby at Vanderbilt are developing these tools that we can use to sort of assess that, because right now we're missing that. I mean, people can tell us that they're very tired, but we may not be able to pinpoint where their issues are. We also hear a lot of anecdotes from kids who have hearing loss, even after we fit them with hearing aids, or they come home from school and they'll fall asleep at like 6 o'clock at night at the dinner table because they've expended so much energy during the day just trying to listen. And I'm hoping that we can develop interventions that will make that easier for them, because that's a challenging thing. If you're spending all your energy just trying to listen, you're probably missing out on some learning opportunities in those situations.
Yeah, I tell people it's like running with two 15-pound weights around your ankles. You can do it, but it's a lot of work. I suspect Zoom fatigue probably is part of that too, that people are so focused that they're worn out by the end of the day.
I've noticed a big difference since we've gone to many more virtual meetings. I would say even now that I'm back in the office, about 80% of my meetings on a daily basis are, via some web online platform. And I feel like it does take more cognitive and listening effort to remain engaged in those meetings. And I've been having more face-to-face meetings recently with staff here. And I'll tell you, I really enjoy that in-person interaction that I did not appreciate before the pandemic. And I do feel like there's a lot more ease of communication and natural back and forth when you're in a room with a person.
You need the banter index, right? Like some sort of measure of banter and how that rapid moving around, because everybody in these, we all wait for the person to finish, right? So you're concentrating, but in natural conversation, it kind of goes back and forth a lot easier, right?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that. We conducted a study with teenagers last year wearing hearing aids, and we wanted to look at this sort of listening effort question. And so we thought that the teenagers might not like this initially, but they ended up loving it. But have you ever heard of the game Headbands?
Yes.
Yeah. So we set up an experiment where a parent and a teenager were in our booth together with speakers surrounding them. and we would play sort of background noise spatialized around them, and we would have them sort of rate their difficulty in playing headbands with each other, which, as you know, is a game that requires the two people to go back and forth verbally quite a lot.
Right.
And it was interesting because not only was were people able to sort of solve the mystery word from headbands faster when there wasn't background noise, but their ease of listening was much higher when it was quieter. And so we're thinking about ways to sort of extend that. It was just sort of a test to see, would this wacky idea of playing a game in our lab, be a good way to look at this? And the feedback that we got from our participants was that not only was it a lot of fun, but that they definitely noticed that it was sensitive to those differences that we might not have picked up on in like a traditional sit in front of the speaker and just repeat words that you hear, which is what we use in audiology. But that's not realistic. No one wants to talk to somebody who's just repeating words back to them. So we're trying to think of more fun and realistic ways to assess and those types of tools, because we think that's going to be the future, is having these things be very relevant.
Yeah. So headbands is like the new form of auditory rehabilitation.
Yeah, absolutely. And for younger kids, we're using the game Guess Who. So because it requires a lot of verbal back and forth between the two. So if anyone else has other ideas for games like that, we would love to. We love games in our lab. That's a fun thing we like to do.
The audiometry, right? I mean, that's that's the whole concept, right?
Yeah.
That's really great. I mean, those are, and I love the creativity that people are thinking kind of outside the box in terms of those types of things. And, I guess you see people that probably have sharper cognition with the ability to do these types of things as well, I assume.
Yeah, as part of all of our experiments in the lab, we measure working memory, both visual, spatial, and verbal, because we know that verbal working memory tasks where you have to listen and repeat something back, those get affected by having hearing loss. But what's interesting about visual spatial tasks is they don't require any of that. It's a mostly visual task. And so it gives you a way to look at that. And we do see that verbal and visual spatial memory both matter in terms of being able to do those sort of complex listening tasks. So it's a key part of all of the testing that we do in the lab. And we also measure some areas of executive function around selective attention and also cognitive flexibility. So your ability to sort of switch rules in the middle of a task. So very, very interesting stuff. And when I started out in audiology, I didn't know that I was going to be also doing these things related to, cognition and executive function, but it's become so important. And I think increasingly it will be relevant in our clinical practice as well.
Yeah. One of the things that's been fascinating, that with taking care of kids, that, if a child has speech language delay, one of the first things they do is they check their hearing, right? And it's fascinating to me in the medical world, if somebody has a cognitive issue, they don't check their hearing. And it's kind of an interesting thing because it seems to me it's all the same in terms of you're not going to have normal cognition. And so you would almost think that every cognitive workup should have a hearing test as the initial assessment, just like every speech language delay has the hearing test.
Yeah, we have a pretty diverse research program that includes a number of different areas outside of hearing, and our colleagues in neurosciences and cognitive psychology, I've sort of made a living collaborating with those individuals because they start to recognize the importance of hearing for the work that they're doing in cognition, but they don't know how to measure it. And so I'm on a number of publications that are related to those fields simply because I was the person who was around who said, hey, we should measure the hearing before you do that auditory task that you're doing to measure their cognition because it may make a difference. And I think you've seen adaptations to tools like the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, which is widely used as a screening tool for cognitive decline, that there's now a version of that is adapted for people with hearing loss. And so I hope we continue to see those collaborations because not only are they fun and cool, but I think they will help people and improve science on both sides and then clinical care, hopefully, as a result.
Yeah, we use the hearing impaired MoCA for patients if we think there's a cognitive issue, especially in the pre-CI cochlear implant process. We're looking for it. But yeah, it is interesting. I mean, even normal cognitive testing, if they can't understand you, it's no wonder they get it wrong.
Well, and I'm sure you've had adult patients that you work with where there was some question or concern about their cognitive ability, and then you get them a hearing aid or a cochlear implant, and it doesn't solve the problem, but their level of functioning is definitely improved. And sometimes it's dramatic. And those are the cases that just make you feel, on one hand, really positive because you helped someone. But on the other hand, you worry about people who haven't accessed hearing care, who could be helped in those ways, but maybe someone's writing off their problem as, oh, they're just getting old, or, they're not following the conversation. Well, I agree with you. We need to make sure that a hearing test is a standard part of every cognitive evaluation, because it's not always going to be the case, but it's certainly not going to make things easier if you have a hearing loss and a cognitive problem on top of it.
Yeah, I worry about obviously untreated hearing loss and then undertreated hearing loss. Those are my two big clinical concerns, and they each have their own impact. And actually, to me, undertreated hearing loss is very invisible, right? Because everybody thinks it's actually being treated well. So it's a big problem.
Yeah, and we know from seeing patients who are fitted at other clinics, if you look at our pediatric population, about half of them are not optimally fitted to optimize audibility. And for our adult patients, sometimes it's even greater problem, because people think, well, they're an adult, they can tell me how it sounds, that's going to help us to optimize it. But we really have to do objective verification measures to make sure that we're actually providing them enough audibility. Because if you allow a new hearing aid user to adjust their own hearing aid, many times they're going to adjust it to the point where it's not providing gain at all.
We do it for comfort, not for reason.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like, oh, I won't take this blood pressure pill because I don't like the side effects, and I'll just suffer the effects of the high blood pressure, right? And it's that concept.
That's a great analogy.
So I know somebody who had bad high blood pressure, and it actually led to kidney failure. And I asked him, like, well, why didn't you treat it? He said, well, I felt fine. Right. And that's what these people say. Well, I thought I heard well. Well, we have to measure it. Just like, if I gave you blood pressure medicine and now your blood pressure is 160/90, say it's treated, it's just not well treated, right? And there's the big difference, right? So, well, this has been great stuff. One of the other questions I like to ask people is like, who do you thank? Like, the people along the way, who are the people that you thank for getting you where you are today?
Well, I have a pretty long list, so I'll try to keep it short, because I really feel like I'm one of the luckiest people in the world, but I've been supported through my entire life by a lot of people. So my parents are just two of the most amazing people you'll ever meet, and they never, ever tried to sort of dissuade me from pursuing science or scientific interests. They fostered that in me as a child, and I feel like that carried me through my entire career, audiology, science. And then, of course, my mentor, Pat Stamakowitz, she really recognized, I don't know that I ever would have gone into a career in research had it not been for Pat's encouragement. And I think just all of my friends and family have been incredibly supportive of my pursuit of this and my career. And my wife has sacrificed a tremendous amount in terms of her career to support me getting a PhD. And, so I always reflect on all of the people who contributed to, helping me to get where I am and continue to do so. It's an ongoing process. And I think it's just good to think about how many people it took to get to this point, because it's certainly not a one-man show.
Yeah. It takes a village, is the saying.
Yes.
So, this has been great. I really appreciate it. Let's say somebody wants to get a hold of you, or they want to suggest a game to you that they think is a great game. How do people get a hold of you?
Well, I have a website on the Boys Town National Research Hospital website for the Audibility, Perception, and Cognition Lab. I'm active on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Ryan W. McCreery. And that's a great way to get a hold of me, especially if you want to engage in lengthy discussions about auditory science or anything really. I'm an extrovert, so pretty interactive as much as people will contact me. So those are probably the best ways to get a hold of me.
No, this has been great. I appreciate you coming on. Fascinating topics, more to explore. Dr. McCreery, thanks so much. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
And I thank you for this great opportunity.
Great. And thank you, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the ListenUp Podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get updates on future episodes.